An excerpt, volume 30, January 7th, 1932. Please explain the diary entry about divine will being wanted, commanded, operative, and completed. Now, for me to explain this to you clearly in theology, I would have to go to the Italian, because there are different English translations on the adjectives that people use here. So I'm going to translate this. I'll do it in Italian and then translate it. Figlia mia, my daughter, la mia volontà ha modi sorprendenti. My will has stupefying ways, e differenti, in different ways, di agire, of acting. So my daughter, my will has outstanding or super, we could say outstanding and different ways of acting. And it acts according to the disposition of creatures, which is what I said earlier. It's not just the degree of intimacy in God's divine will does not just depend upon a predisposition, but also upon the capacity that God gives our soul. So he tells her it has different ways of acting according to the disposition of the creature's predisposition. Okay. Agisce secondo le disposizioni delle creature. Molte volte fa conoscere ciò che essa vuole. Many times it makes known that which it wants, meaning his will wants. Ma lascia a disposizione delle creature il fare e non fare. But it leaves up to the disposition of the creature the way in which it wants to do it, and how to do his will, or not to do his will, sorry. It leads up to the creature, the disposition, ma lascia a disposizione delle creature, leads up to the disposition of the creature, doing his will or not doing his will. So we're free to say yes or no to God. E questa si chiama volontà voluta. And this is called willed will. Volontà voluta. Or you may say, to make it more understandable, the divine will that has been willed. The willed will. Remember, Jesus appeals to Louisa according to her capacity. So he's using words that she can understand. So sometimes it may be simple, but the theology behind willed will, volontà voluta, means God's expressed will, you can say. He wants this to be done. That's an expressed will. You can also call it willed will. So now you know the meaning of a willed will. It's like expressed will. Altre volte, other times, al volere aggiunge il comando. At other times, to the human will, it adds a command. So God may have an expressed will, then he commands. He expresses his will, now he expresses a command. So you have volontà voluta, expressed will, or willed will, and then volontà comandata, commanded will. So other times, to the will, to the human will, God adds a command. E dà doppia grazia per fare seguire il comando, and gives double the grace in order for the soul to carry out this commanded will. E questa è di tutti i cristiani, and this applies to all Christians. Il non fare ciò significa, and not doing this means, non essere neppure cristiani, not even being a Christian. Meaning, if you know God is commanding you to do something, and you don't do it, you don't deserve to be called Christian. L'altro modo è operativo. Another way in which God's will reveals itself is in an operative way. So here we've gone through three different types of adjectives for God's will. His willed will or expressed will, his commanded will or commanding will, and now his operative will or operating will. Now, what is this operating will? Scende nell'atto della creatura, and it descends within the act of the creature, e opera come se l'atto della creatura fosse atto suo, and it operates as if the act of the creature is God's own act. So God consents to the creature's act, as it were, making it his own act. Because at this point, the soul is united with God intimately, and God trusts the soul to now do whatever the soul intends to do. E perciò, come atto suo, and therefore as an act that is God's, meaning God's consenting to the soul's interests so that he makes the soul's act his own act, whereby it's God's act. And therefore, as an act, as his act, as God's act, vi mette la sua vita, God deposits within this human act his own life, his own sanctity, la sua santità, la sua virtù operatrice, his operative virtue. Ma per giungere a questo, but in order to arrive at this point, l'anima deve essere abituata alla volontà voluta e comandata. But in order for the soul to arrive at the operating will of God, it must be habitually united with God's willed will or expressed will and his commanding will or commanded will. So the soul progresses from first God's expressed will or willed will. Then that's a degree in the will of God, in the eternal mode. Because it goes from one degree to another degree. These are not states, they're degrees. The one state is God's eternal mode, his eternal will. From the willed will or expressed will, revealed to the intellect, to the commanding will, revealed to the will. Now the will has to carry it out, commanded will. To the operative will, where God now puts his own life, his own sanctity, and his operating virtue within the soul. That's the third degree in the divine will. These are general degrees. There are many degrees in between here too, but these are the principal degrees, going from God's willed will. There's a fourth degree coming up soon. His willed will to his, or you could say expressed will, to his commanded will, to now his operative will. Now, in order for the soul to get to this third stage of his operative will, or his third degree, it has to be habitually united with his expressed will, willed will, or commanded will. Questo prepara il vuoto nell'atto. So this operative will, the third degree, disposes the soul, prepares the soul for a void within the human act, in order to receive l'atto operante del fiat divino, the operative act, or the operating act of God's divine fiat. So let us wrap our brains around this. We go through these three degrees, where God's expressed will, his willed will, and his operating will, are in us. And this operating will, that comes after the expressed will and willed will, prepares a void in our human act. And what's this void? Now, by the way, Jesus tells Louisa, you know how these voids are formed in us? Many times by suffering, by God depriving us of his consolations. Louisa would suffer when Jesus would not visit her. And Jesus informed her one time when she was sorrowing that it's necessary for me to allow you not to have these consolations of my visitations, because this time of separation from me allows a void to be formed in your soul. And Jesus refers to these voids that God, helps form in the soul in Adam when he was in Eden. Not through suffering, there was no suffering in Eden, but so that Adam could contain more of God and more of God. It's an unfolding process. It never ends. So we can never get to the point on earth where we could say, I've contained so much God that I can no longer contain him. We will always be able to contain more of God. But our rate of containment, our rate of growth in the divine will depends upon our disposition. And of course, the capacity of the soul God gives us. So Jesus, after telling Louisa that this operative virtue, I just went over the 3 o'clock mark, I'll try to wrap it up here, prepares a void in the soul, in the human act in particular, to receive his operating act of the divine fiat. But it never stops, you see? That's why we can never fully contain God to the point where we say, enough. We can fully contain him, but we can never say enough. And this atto operante chiamo l'atto compiuto. Here's the fourth degree of living in his will. L'atto operante, the operating act, calls or summons, beckons. L'atto compiuto summons the accomplished act. And this accomplished act is the holiest act. L'atto più santo, più potente, most powerful act, più bello, most beautiful act, più fulgido, most refulgent act of light that my divine will is able to do. So here we have four stages: expressed or willed will, commanding or commanded will, operative or operating will, to accomplished will. Apart from that, God wants us to enter within the center of the divine will. That's the real difference between on loan and permanent. Having the gift on loan and having the gift permanently. Louisa, when she received the gift of living in the divine will, on loan, which was in her teenage years, was becoming more and more accustomed to it. And on loan, again, was not God taking it away from her. It was her letting go of it. So God said, I'm giving you the gift on loan because God foresaw from his eternal mind that she would let go of it. That's why he called it on loan. Not because God takes it back, but because he foresees she will let go of it. That's why he says it's on loan. But he gave himself 100% to her, even on loan. And therefore, it was not until the age of 23 and a half-ish that she received the gift of living in the divine will. And then it wasn't until the age of 35, November 16th, 1900, that she entered the center of the divine will. That is living completely in the divine. So on loan and permanent are not the only two stages of the divine will. We go into the divine will on loan, and then we go intermittently back and forth due to our own neglect. Then we go in never to leave due to our attentiveness and our loyalty, fidelity, holy fear, holy respect. But things don't end there. Then we continue to go more deeply into these concentric rings of God's center, which Louisa attained at the age of 35. And once we enter the center, then now we can't get any more intimate with God, apart from growing in degrees, okay? These are stages: loan, permanent, then spiritual marriage on earth, in heaven, exchanging of hearts with Christ, exchanging of hearts with the Trinity, which Louisa experienced 4 nuptials, then getting into the center. These are all stages. But once we get to the center of the divine will, then it's a growth permanently in degrees.
For more on the 4 degrees of the divine will, what they consist of, and how to advance within them, I refer you to this video on the Elijah Cloak's YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe to help us promote this content. Thank you for joining.